How do I explain my job? Imagine you work at a convenience store and the sodas in the fridge start talking to you. It's kind of like that. Yeah, I think that about sums it up. But instead of a cashier, I'm a mortuary assistant. I work in a morgue under a hospital. And a few months back, the corpses started talking to me. I know that sounds unbelievable, psychotic, unhinged. But honestly, the dead bodies sitting up and spilling their guts isn't even the worst part. It's the things they tell me that make my guts twist. I guess I should start at the beginning. I've always been a good listener. That's one of those natural skills that you can't really learn. You're just born with it. The shoulder to cry on, the sympathetic ear, or any other body part that can be a cushion for someone's thoughts, desires, and fears. That's me. I remember being around 12 or 13 years old and having deep, serious conversations with my father. Conversations that a man probably shouldn't be having with his son, but our relationship was always different. Growing up without a mom will do that, I guess. We were always more like friends than a dad and his kid. We'd talk about dad's life, his work, how much he missed mom, and sometimes how much he really wanted a drink. But I thought it was all for the better. I wouldn't be where I am now if I didn't turn out the way I did. I wouldn't have been blessed. In the beginning, being a corpse handler was something that I sort of fell into by complete accident. I was young at the time, barely starting college. My then girlfriend had a dream of opening her own funeral home. In a stroke of complete genius and infatuation, I decided that I'd join her. We'd complete school together and start our own joint venture, a funeral home to call our own. The stuff of romance. Things didn't work out between us in the end. But I did find that I was honestly fascinated by the job. I'd always been interested in stuff like that since Mom died. I was never somebody who got queasy at the sight of a bloody injury or a nasty car accident. The first time I actually worked on a dead body, it felt just as natural to me as well, listening to people's problems. I've spent my entire life as a kind of sounding board for the people I care about. Everyone trusted me with their deepest secrets. I don't even think it's that I give the best advice or have the perfect solution to every problem. I usually don't, if I'm being truthful. But sometimes people just need to be heard. Lately, though, when it comes to work, my listening skills have been a bit of a problem. I was more than happy being a low-level assistant. I just wanted an easy job that would let me turn my brain off as I wheeled bodies around. The atmosphere and pace of this type of gig suited me just fine. That's how I started in this field, and it's pretty much where the normal part of the story ends. Things just got so much worse. I'd been working at a hospital in St. Clair, slinging dead bodies around for about 3 years when they asked me to swap to the night shift. I thought about it for a bit. The pay was better by a few dollars, and I've always been a night person on top of everything else. So I agreed. I didn't even have any of the typical fears or hang-ups you'd expect. The idea of being alone at night with tons of dead bodies didn't really scare me. I knew that the corpses were just that dead. At least I thought so. God, if I could go back in time, I'd strangle myself on the spot before accepting the job. So like I said, things started out normally enough. Well, enough for a morgue in the basement of a hospital at least. It wasn't unusual to see messed up, twisted bodies of all colors, shapes, and sizes. There are a lot of different ways a human can die in a major hospital. They didn't all talk, though. Not at first. The first time it happened, I thought my coworker Dave was playing a prank on me. It was 3 a.m. We had just wheeled in the corpses of an elderly man and woman. Their respective causes of death weren't immediately obvious to me. There were no fatal injuries that I could see, so I thought old age was probably a safe bet. We just transferred the first body from the gurney to the slab. I had my back to Dave, filling out some paperwork about the old man. It was going as normally as you'd expect when a voice cut through the still air. It was the kind of dry, throaty voice that could only belong to something not from this world. It's funny how humans just have some innate ability to sense when something is wrong. My hand froze, the pen hovering over the paper as the raspy voice let out a single word. Killed. In that moment, I'll admit that I wasn't really scared. I just laughed and turned around, expecting to see Dave with a stupid grin. Very funny, I quipped. Dave still had his back turned, but he turned around and raised an eyebrow when he heard me. Killed, I repeated, in a half-assed attempt at a zombie voice. The confused look never left Dave's face. What does that mean? He seemed genuinely lost. I chuckled again, a little more hollow this time. Didn't you just... I trailed off before I could finish the question. Dave rolled his eyes. Yeah, good one. Anyway, listen. I need to run to the bathroom. He didn't wait for my response as he set his clipboard down and left me alone with the two bodies. The room went deathly silent as I heard Dave's footsteps receding up the hall. The only sound left was the hum of the fluorescent lights above my head. I stood there alone, standing still in the freezing morgue. There was just this feeling like something hanging in the air, some sort of aura. I don't know how to describe it. My eyes were now locked on the body directly in front of me. The old man. His eyes were closed, his skin pale and wrinkled. I held my breath. Then there was a sound like bones cracking and the faint squeak of aged and dry rubber wheels rolling gently on cold linoleum. Killed. Killed. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled as that same hoarse voice drifted through the air. It felt like it was worming its way between my ears and into my brain, and it was coming from behind me, from the other body. Slowly, I turned to face her. I felt the color drain from my face as I saw what was waiting behind me. The dead woman was sitting up on her gurney. Her eyes were still scrunched closed, but a stiff grin had spread across her previously blank face, her face that was supposed to be dead. I could see her body had begun showing signs of breaking down. Her flesh was discolored and turning purple. Her gray hair was a wiry rat's nest from being roughly transported to the morgue from wherever she had died. I watched in horror as her mouth slowly opened, exposing teeth stained brown from years of smoking. The voice drifted out from her rotting throat again, but it wasn't like the dead woman was speaking. It was almost like her body was just the vessel for a voice coming from another place, like some kind of demented ventriloquist act. Her mouth didn't move. It simply hung open as the withered voice repeated that single word again. Killed, she said. I felt my knees getting weak. Sweat beaded on my forehead. Where the hell was Dave? I guess I still held out a bit of hope that this was all an elaborate joke. Then a cold, clammy hand grasped my shoulder. I didn't need to turn around to know. I already knew who it was. I didn't even hear him get up. Another one of those awful voices from the pit of hell whispered directly into my ear. Have you ever felt someone whisper in your ear? The heat of their breath, almost like there's a warmth to what they're saying. You feel their humanity in every word. There was no humanity here, no breath, no warmths. Just icy, alien nothing. The dead man croaked out two words. Our son. I shut my eyes tight, feeling my body shudder in horror. When I opened them, I was in the same room, under the same lights. still staring at a corpse sitting up with its mouth wide open. Then there was an awful sound like wet meat being shoved through a drain. The woman forced her eyes open. They were nothing but milky, empty orbs staring into my soul. Suddenly she swung her rigid legs around to the side. It's a motion I'm very familiar with. She was trying to get up. Seeing that snapped something in my brain, and I ran. I bolted out of the morgue, crashing through the swinging doors. I nearly knocked over a very confused Dave as he walked down the hall with 2 coffees. I jumped in my car and peeled out of the hospital's parking lot. I drove down dark city streets, not really knowing where I wanted to go. I almost crashed a few times. Every time I stopped at a light and tried to close my eyes to calm myself down, all I saw was that open, rotting mouth and those empty eyes. Their voices repeated over and over in my head. Killed. Our son. I pulled into a gas station eventually and just sat in my car, shaking for what felt like hours. I couldn't think. My brain was fried. Then I remembered something about the hospital and realized what they meant. St. Clair's Hospital had been treating an old man for the last several weeks. He had some kind of degenerative brain disease that destroyed his memories. No living relatives. He'd always been alone. That was one of the cases I'd followed since the old man had first been admitted. But I knew that the same hospital had a policy of assigning next of kin for funerals. After pulling some strings, I was able to find out that the hospital had just buried this same old man, and, to my horror, had also found and assigned next of kin to 2 of the cadavers I'd been working on the night before. They were the son and daughter of the old man who had just died. They had died days before their father. I've been working the night shift ever since, and there's no doubt in my mind that the dead talk. They don't speak every night. It's usually quieter than that first time. But when the morgue is full and the air is still, I can hear them whispering. They say things that make my skin crawl. Things that make me want to find a new job. But for some reason I can't bring myself to quit. Something about them keeps drawing me back to that awful, dark basement. That and the voices of the dead. When I graduated high school, everyone was shocked when I revealed my chosen field of study. Mortuary science isn't exactly a common career path. However, those closest to me weren't surprised, as I'd always been interested in things people usually consider weird or unusual. I spent much of my free time learning about death-related topics, Victorian mourning traditions, plagues, and cultural celebrations like the Day of the Dead. You get the picture. My dream was to one day open my own funeral home. I enjoyed the solitude and straightforward nature of working with the deceased. Although working with grieving families could be challenging, I like to think that providing them with a good funeral service help them begin their grieving process. I'm no stranger to grief. In 7th grade, my best friend, Lorelei, was hit by a car while walking home from school one afternoon. She spent a few days in the hospital before dying from internal bleeding. We had been best friends since 1st grade. Many people assumed my interest in death began with her, but that's simply not true. I'd been fascinated with death for as long as I could remember, and Lorelei was one of the few people who didn't make me feel like a freak because of it. I recall going to her funeral and asking the funeral director some questions. On the somber drive home, I announced to my parents that I wanted to work in a funeral home. They assumed it was just a phase, at least for the first year or 2. I was fortunate to find a job right away at a local funeral home, Hughes Funeral Service. My boss, Scott, was a retired naval officer who ran a very tight ship, no pun intended. He had detailed procedures that had to be followed precisely. My coworkers often found this annoying, but I didn't mind the structure. Toward the end of my training, which took place during the day and early evening, Scott asked how I felt about working the overnight shift the next night. I nodded and assured him it would be fine. Scott seemed tense and skeptical of my response. Working nights here isn't like most places where you can just goof off because the boss isn't around, he warned. If you think there are a lot of rules during the day, you're in for a surprise at night. Do you think you can handle that? I did my best to reassure him that I took my job seriously and would follow his instructions. On my way out, he handed me an envelope and advised me to keep it handy whenever I worked nights. He told me to read it thoroughly before coming in at 10 p.m. for my first night shift. When I got home that night, I opened the envelope and began reading the rules. 1. At the beginning of your shift, place coins over the eyes of the dead. Complete this task by 11 p.m. 2. Prop the morgue door open. If you hear a coin drop, lock yourself in the janitor's closet until midnight. At midnight, go directly to the mortuary and make sure everything is back in place. 3. Keep the window next to the main office open. A black cat will enter at some point during the night. When it arrives, give it a treat from the jar on the desk. The cat will likely remain until morning, so leave the window open for it to leave when ready. Never place a body on the bottom left rack in the mortuary, and do not disturb the cat while it sleeps. If any of these steps are missed, a tall, pale woman will wander the building, calling out for the cat. If she doesn't find it, she will start crying and screaming, which will continue for the rest of the night. 4. Before midnight, a man in a sailor's uniform will appear in the hallway, staring at the clock. He will talk to himself. Do not touch or speak to him. If interrupted, he will start bashing his head into the wall, causing all electronics in the building to malfunction permanently. 5. If you smell smoke, don't panic. It's unlikely the building is on fire. Walk past the parlor to check if there's a family, a husband, wife, and 2 young children sitting there. If they are, prepare coffee for the parents and milk for the children. You may nod and smile, but do not speak. If you mess this up, the room will catch fire, and you'll be responsible for the damages. 6. The most important rule: if a hearse arrives at 3 a.m., unlock the door, but do not speak to the driver. He may look strange, but do not react. The last employee who failed to follow this rule has been missing for over a year. I'm not sure if it's related, but I wouldn't take any chances. This wasn't what I expected. There's no way this is real, I thought. While I believed in the supernatural, this level of activity in a functioning business seemed impossible. I chuckled Scott was probably hazing me. The next night I went in for my shift. My coworker, Kate, wished me luck, but I could hear the trepidation in her voice. I took over and walked her out to her car. The silence of the place after dark hit me, so I put on some music. I glanced at the list, unsure of what to do. It was probably a prank or maybe a trust exercise rather than hazing. Scott was very particular about who he hired and took the responsibilities seriously. I decided to err on the side of caution and follow the rules. I started by grabbing the jar of coins and taking them to the morgue. Placing the coins on the eyes of the deceased felt strange, like participating in an ancient ritual. Next, I headed to the main office and opened the window, just in time. A black cat dove inside, startling me. "Hey," I said, gently petting it. The cat purred and quickly warmed up to me. I gave it a treat as instructed, and it took off to the basement morgue, just as the letter said it would. With not much work to do at this time of night, I watched some TV on my phone. Suddenly I heard something. I paused the show and listened. A low, shallow voice came from the hallway. I quietly stepped out of the office. Although I binge watch horror movies and don't scare easily, what I saw gave me goosebumps. A man stood there, murmuring as he glanced between the clock on the wall and a compass in his right hand. As I got closer, I could hear what he was saying. This can't be right. This has to be north. Why isn't it working? He wore a naval uniform that appeared damp, with bits of seaweed dangling from his clothing. At first, I thought this might be Scott playing a trick on me, but as I got closer and saw his face, I knew it wasn't a prank. His face was gray and decaying. I stood there silently, then a maggot fell from his ear, landing in front of me. I jumped and narrowly avoided screaming. I backed away, realizing this might not be a joke. I returned to the office, trying to calm down by doing some busy work. The cat came back upstairs, stretched, and sat at my feet before heading back to the morgue for its nap. Just then, I heard a faint ting. I jolted. Had a coin dropped? Maybe the cat knocked something over, I thought. Still, I headed to the janitor's closet just to be safe. I sat there for 10 minutes. It was 11:57. I hadn't heard any other noise. Curiosity got the better of me. My fascination with death and the supernatural made it hard to stay put. I decided to check the morgue before midnight. Even if something supernatural was happening, it would stop shortly after I got down there, since the letter said it was safe to exit the closet after midnight. I crept down the stairs. To my dismay, the motion light didn't turn on as usual. I heard a faint dragging noise and turned on my phone's flashlight to look around. Nothing seemed out of place. Then I noticed movement in a dark corner. My flashlight wasn't much help. The dragging noise stopped and was replaced by cracking. In the darkness, a thin figure stood up. I recognized it as a body Scott, and I had prepared for a showing the previous day. I felt myself stop breathing. The bones and cartilage cracked as it rose. Its posture was abnormal, with the spine curved at an unnatural angle. The body's head practically turned backward to face me, and I felt frozen. A noise that was part hiss, part raspy breathing came from its lips. Its mouth opened unnaturally wide, ripping the wires we used to keep cadavers' mouths closed for showings. The figure darted toward me, holding a hypodermic needle, the same ones we used for embalming. This thing was trying to embalm me. I ran up the stairs, hearing it crash after me, bones and cartilage still cracking with every movement. Just as I was about to reach the top step, I felt a cold, stiff hand grab my calf. I kicked hard, but its grip held firm. Frantically, I shook my leg and punched it. Then something shifted. Its grip loosened, and I saw its body go limp. I looked at the time, midnight. It took me over an hour to make sure everything was back in place in the mortuary. What I experienced that night made me question everything I believed about death and the supernatural. I went back upstairs to take a break. I was eating my lunch when I began to smell smoke. I checked the list and walked past the parlor, where I saw the family sitting there. I made coffee for the parents and poured milk for the children. The husband nodded at me. I smiled, nodded back, and left without saying a word. The smoke cleared. The rest of the night was uneventful. When Scott arrived in the morning, he asked how it went. I hesitated, debating whether to tell him the truth. Eventually, I settled for a simple answer. It was a good night. I was working late at the office one night. We have a big 2-story building in a business complex, and sometimes if we have to catch up on work, we kind of have to stay late. I had taken 2 sick days the week before, so I really had to get my project done and didn't have much time left to do it. I planned to stay a few hours this night and a few hours the next night to get caught up, leaving anywhere between 1 and 2 a.m. Often others would be there late as well. But this night it was just me. I was working at my desk, which was in the middle of a room full of desks. As I typed away on my laptop, I started to get a little drowsy. After fighting it for a bit, I got up to make some coffee in the break room. I started the machine and leaned against the table, barely keeping my eyes open as it slowly poured into the mug. A sudden thud shook me awake. It sounded like it was downstairs, but it was really loud, resonating through the whole building. Nothing followed the sound though, it was just the one thud. I walked over to the doorway and looked out at the stairs, debating whether or not to see what it was. Honestly, I was so tired I thought it had to just be something falling in one of the rooms downstairs and chose not to investigate. I grabbed my mug and went back to my desk, continuing to work. I sat there for an hour non-stop working, but the coffee really wasn't fixing my sleepiness problem. I kept working, trying to power through it, but I was only prolonging the inevitable. At some point, I dozed off at my desk. When my eyes opened, I remember being immediately irritated and somewhat dizzy, like I'd been annoyingly woken up from a deep sleep. As I regained my senses, I noticed a sound coming from somewhere in the building. It was a beep, sounding every 4 or 5 seconds, but very faint. I looked at my laptop. Seeing it was nearly 2 a.m., I decided it wasn't worth trying to work anymore. So I packed up my things and brought them with me as I left the room to both check on the beeping and to leave afterwards. As I got to the stairwell, the beeping started to make me nervous. I'd never heard it before, and there was something eerie about it. Maybe I was too tired before to fully comprehend it. I walked down the staircase, and now with the beeping much louder, I peered into the long main hallway. At the far end, there was a metal rod laying on the ground right in front of the open entrance door. I felt blood rush from my face, knowing it should be locked up and realizing the beeping was from the building's security system. With nothing but instinct to go off of, I ran to the opposite end of the hallway and out the back door, getting in my car to call for help. Although I was out of the building, what I learned next was far more terrifying. Police pulled in and searched around, not finding anyone or anything. When we checked the security cameras at 11 p.m., a man could be seen walking up and breaking the door open with a single hit from some kind of tool, creating the bang sound that I heard while getting coffee. He then quietly moved around the first floor and up to the second, where he came into the office I was in and stood quietly only a few feet behind me while I was working at my desk. He then went back downstairs, coming up again while I was sleeping, and walked around the whole office, even going right up to me and searching around my desk. It's not clear if he stole anything, as there weren't cameras in every room, but there didn't seem to be any obvious answer as to what he was doing there. After seeing the security tapes, I've never stayed alone at that office again. You said you can work the graveyard shift. That's why we hired you. Daryl was filling out a stack of paperwork as his supervisor, Malcolm, spoke to him from behind his desk. Today was Daryl's first day at his new job. Daryl had just been fired from his previous security job for suspected theft and hadn't had the luxury of being choosy about his next position. But this nearly deserted hospital on the far side of the bridge, in a part of the city that he would have never visited otherwise, had been willing to hire him right away. An employment agency had connected Daryl with Malcolm earlier in the week. Yesterday, Malcolm asked Daryl over the phone to report to work in the early evening instead of at midnight so he'd have time to fill out the required forms and go over his duties. Malcolm had told Daryl that he had never been in the hospital building during the late night shift, but that everyone who worked the shift reported to him. It's such a hard vacancy to fill. Well, that's everything. Just sign here and here. You'll get your first paycheck mailed to the address on file. In about 2 weeks, Malcolm tried to smile pleasantly as he watched Daryl complete the final form, but it was late, and he wanted to be at home. "Thank you, sir. I'm just glad to be here," Daryl said with a modicum of sincerity. "I'm sure that we'll have a good working relationship." Malcolm rested his folded hands over his conspicuous paunch, not saying anything but still smiling. "Okay, you can grab some dinner across the street at Melvin's. Everybody who works late eats there, including the nurses." Malcolm's smile faded. "But we don't want any trouble with them, you hear me?" Yes, sir. I'll keep my hands to myself," Sir Daryl reassured his new boss, putting his pen back into his shirt pocket. "That's good. It's good. If you work the graveyard shift, you won't see many of them anyway. Besides, most of the pretty ones work during the day. The point is, don't get too friendly with the nurses." Malcolm stood and shook Daryl's hand, walking around his desk to see him out of his office. "At least an hour before midnight, take the elevator to the 13th floor," Malcolm reminded him. "Look for Reggie and take over for him once he shows you the ropes. Otherwise, your shift starts at midnight every night that you're scheduled, unless I say different. I won't see you again for another few weeks, not until our monthly staff meeting on the last Thursday of the month." Walking through one of the hospital's revolving turnstiles, Daryl exited onto the busy street. It was a warm summer evening, and he watched a hazy orange sun drift over the tops of the tall buildings on the borough's far side. Daryl missed his hometown upstate, but he was excited to have moved to the city and eagerly anticipated the opportunities he believed it would eventually offer him. Would he gain fame one day as an actor? This was his hope. Daryl explored the city blocks and then ate his dinner at Melvin's. Leaving the restaurant, he sprinted across the street to the hospital's main building, its floors now lit against the backdrop of the nighttime city. Daryl narrowly dodged the oncoming traffic, coming close to a speeding taxi. Reaching the hospital, he paused at the corner. The corner was different from its companion at the hospital's front. It too was inlaid with gray bricks, but there was a dedication plaque, likely to a donor or the hospital's founder. Examining the dedication, Daryl noted the hospital's name and date, late in the last century. There was also a man's name, Nathaniel Wingett. The dedication under Wingett's name read, "For our lives eternal." There was a circle in each of the plaque's four corners, and within each was an ornate symbol and letters too small for Daryl to easily decipher. Daryl walked through the hospital lobby and took the elevator to the 13th floor. A bell chimed as the elevator doors opened, allowing him a view of the floor's reception desk. Daryl greeted the nurse on duty as he approached and asked for Reggie, indicating that he was the new midnight shift guard. "Reggie's finishing his rounds. He should be back soon," the nurse replied affably. "But there's still hours to go in his shift. Aren't you early?" The nurse seemed perplexed that anyone would want to get a head start on the graveyard shift, especially on the cancer and hospice floor. Daryl inhaled the faint smell of death, an odor even the antiseptic couldn't hide. "Yeah, but I didn't want to spend it in the downstairs lobby. Malcolm said I should show up here early if I wanted to." Daryl looked around and saw that there was still staff wandering the halls. He knew almost all of them would leave before the beginning of his shift. "Suit yourself. You can wait in the nurse's lounge down the hall until Reggie circles back. I made fresh coffee only an hour ago." The nurse gave a tight smile and turned back to the magazine that she had previously been engrossed in. The walls of the hospital looked worn and tired, as if every place Daryl had gone desperately needed a fresh coat of paint. The doors to the patient rooms were also shabby, with black adhesive tape placed over the odd inset window. Daryl wondered if anywhere in the hospital had been renovated recently. He stopped at a wide picture window further down the hallway and peered out over the city. High-rises blocked most of the view of the bay, but Daryl could still see the body of water and a small island in the distance. The 13th floor was the hospital's top floor, and according to Malcolm, it would soon be nearly deserted. Daryl pushed open the door to the lounge and found two nurses in conversation, foam coffee cups in hand. The women turned as Daryl entered. "Oh, you, the new hire," the younger nurse asked, emptying her cup and tossing it in the waste bin near the metal sink. Yes, ma, I am. Today's my first day on the night shift. I'm going to meet Reggie soon." Daryl tried to be polite, but the women seemed to be in on a joke that he wasn't aware of. The older nurse wore a sly grin as she replied to him. "Well, good luck with that. Not many can handle the graveyard shift up here. Most quit after some months, and even a few weeks. Some of the nurses think there's something off about the floor." The younger nurse was smirking now, as if unable to believe that anyone would be foolish enough to take this job. "You don't say. You mean like the floor is haunted or something?" Daryl didn't believe in the supernatural, but he noticed the nurses seemed serious, even convinced. "Can't say," the nurse replied. "No one except the late-night guard shift ever sees anything. The guys sometimes complain that they see or hear things at night, since I've been here. A few guards have just up and left without warning, punch out at the end of their shifts and don't show back up to work the next day. Some don't even bother to call." The nurses exchanged glances and then walked past Daryl, not bothering to make any pleasantries as they exited the room. Daryl stood alone in the lounge, thinking back to the phone call with Malcolm. Malcolm had asked some personal questions: if he was married and if he had family in the city. No, Daryl told him. He was single and his parents weren't from around here. He had only arrived months ago from upstate. Hearing this, Malcolm had offered him the job. Returning to the reception desk with a cup of coffee, Daryl found a man wearing a blue security guard uniform chatting to the nurse that he had spoken to earlier. The man turned and seemed to recognize Daryl, offering his hand in greeting as Daryl approached. "Daryl," the man said, giving him a firm handshake. "I'm Reggie. I work the evening shift on this floor, and I have for years." "Malcolm said that you're a country boy from upstate." Perturbed by the question, Daryl replied, "No, I'm just from upstate, not the countryside." Slapping Daryl's shoulder, Reggie said, "Well, if it ain't here, it might as well be the country." Reggie gave a hearty laugh, amused by his own joke. "Come on, I'll show you the lockers downstairs and get you in your new uniform." Reggie and Daryl took the elevator to the basement level, and then they made their way down a narrow hallway to a locker room used by the hospital staff. Daryl could hear the building's furnace working in a room not far from the lockers. "Oh, that's the old furnace," Reggie said, noticing Daryl's distractedness. "Morgue's down here too. The orderlies bring the bodies to the morgue, and medical waste is disposed of in their furnace. I don't like to stay down here for too long. The air, it ain't right." Reggie handed Daryl a hospital guard uniform from an empty locker and then told him that the locker was his. He then gave him a set of keys and a heavy flashlight, saying that he might need to enter a locked room during the night, or that there could be a sudden power outage. "Lights on the floor ain't so good. Once changed, you'll go upstairs and I'll give you the tour. While you do that, I'll need to use the commode." Reggie chuckled as he exited the locker room. The darkened hospital hallways were so poorly lit that Daryl was forced to use his flashlight to see ahead of him. The nurse that Daryl had met on the 13th floor earlier had already left. All of the other medical staff had exited as well. As Daryl walked the floor, he could still see some of the patients asleep in their rooms. A few of the patients seemed to be breathing heavily, and he heard a distant moan. Daryl wasn't a fan of hospitals, not because he disliked being near the ill, but because of the equipment that kept patients alive. He didn't know what half of the machines even did, though they all made him uneasy. He felt out of place on the cancer floor and remembered the nurse's foreboding words about those who had quit the graveyard shift after only a short time. Reggie Darrell called, realizing that he had already lost sight of his new partner. Reggie was crouched over, fumbling with a key that he had pulled from his belt. He unlocked a wooden door and stood aside as Darrell approached. "In here," Reggie said. Darrell entered the room, only to find a medical supply closet filled with gauze, bandages, alcohol pads, patient gowns, and a cot. Reggie walked over to the cot and patted it with one hand. "This is where I sometimes take a nap when it's really late. The nurses never come in here." Darrell looked over the cot, noting its stains before replying, "You sleep in here, Reggie? Man, it looks filthy. You sure this is sanitary?" "I don't stay here long," Reggie said defensively. "It beats working in a chair all night. Some of the rooms on this floor are empty too. They keep the extra patients on the floors below us. I think they used to keep more patients up here years ago. But most of this floor is shut down now. The cancer wards almost moved to a newer building. It was supposed to happen years ago, but they just ain't got around to it yet. They're moving the old folks to that building too." Reggie scratched his head, then pulled his handkerchief from his pocket to wipe his brow. "You mean the hospice patients?" Darrell asked, still standing in the doorway. He was trying to remember all the details Malcolm had given him, and he knew that patients on this floor would need more attention than anyone else in the building. "Yeah, the hospice patients," Reggie replied. "They're gonna need a lot more medical attention, and some just ain't gonna make it to the move. Others can't get around at all. If you hear moaning, it's just one of them, probably near death. Even their family won't be here this late." This comment made Darrell nervous, but he tried to maintain his composure. "You ever been with someone as they passed?" Reggie Darrell asked. "Nah, I ain't a nurse. It's just my job to call one if I think a patient's about to go," Reggie replied. "I've seen a few near the end though, if that's what you mean." "Did you know them?" Reggie exhaled loudly. "Well, I didn't know them well, but I remember them. When you see someone struggling to breathe for a while, you don't forget it." "Yeah, that must be tough," Darrell replied, looking into the dim hallway beyond the door. "Look, don't worry. You'll get used to it. You may not know who's in what room now, but by the end of the week, you won't be able to forget them." Reggie noticed the time on his watch and cleared his throat before telling Darrell that his shift was nearly over. They both walked back down the hallway toward the elevators. Darrell could still hear that same distant moaning as they reached the floor's entrance. He was curious and decided to investigate. He opened a few doors to nearby rooms, but none of the patients inside was responsible for the noise. "What are you doing?" Reggie asked from behind. Darrell turned to find Reggie watching him, seemingly agitated. Reggie quickly walked over and slammed the door that Darrell had been holding open. "I heard something. I just wanted to check if anyone was in trouble," Darrell said, puzzled by Reggie's reaction. "You're hearing things. Look, take my advice, only check rooms when you know someone should be in them. Most are locked for a reason. Some of the rooms haven't had patients in them for a long time. And stay away from the far corners of the floor. The staff says they've got a problem with vermin." Reggie stopped and looked directly at Darrell. "Listen, just take it easy tonight. Follow your schedule and stay out of those empty rooms." Darrell nodded, watching Reggie step into the elevator. The doors closed, leaving Darrell to stare at his reflection in the shiny metal. Once Reggie was gone, Darrell went back to the reception desk. He wanted to find out who was in which room, so he picked up the patient log and made his way down the corridor again, this time alone. His curiosity was growing. He had heard a moaning sound twice already and had seen Reggie become defensive when he tried to investigate it. While reading the log, he realized that there was an error on the list. According to the log, all the rooms in the hall were supposed to be empty, but there were patients in some of them. Daryl wanted to double-check what he had seen, so he cautiously approached the room that Reggie had warned him to stay away from. He opened the door and was met with the acrid smell of sickness, stronger than he had encountered earlier. The room was poorly lit, but Daryl's flashlight revealed a figure lying on a bed. The patient was a frail old woman, barely moving. Daryl stared at her, feeling a sense of pity and dread. Her eyes opened, and she looked at him, her mouth trembling as she tried to speak. Her voice was faint, almost drowned out by the whir of the machines surrounding her. "Help me," she whispered. Daryl's heart raced as he stepped closer to the bed, unsure of what to do. "Please, help me," she repeated, her voice strained and desperate. "I'll get a nurse," Daryl stammered, backing away toward the door. But when he turned to leave, the door slammed shut on its own. He spun around, his flashlight flickering as the temperature in the room suddenly dropped. The woman's whisper became a low, guttural moan that seemed to echo throughout the room. "Help me," she shrieked, her voice now distorted and inhuman. Terrified, Daryl bolted for the door, fumbling with the handle before it finally gave way. He burst out of the room and into the hallway, his mind racing. He could still hear the woman's moans echoing behind him as he fled down the corridor, past the empty rooms, and back to the safety of the reception desk. Daryl stood there, panting, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He glanced at the patient log, which still listed the room as empty. His thoughts raced. Was the hospital haunted? Were the nurses playing a trick on him? Daryl couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong on the 13th floor. Suddenly, the elevator doors opened, and a familiar figure stepped out. It was Reggie, but something about him was off. His eyes were cold and his expression was blank. "I told you to stay out of those rooms," he said flatly, his voice devoid of the warmth he had shown earlier. Daryl froze, staring at Reggie in disbelief. What's going on here?" he demanded, his voice trembling. Reggie walked slowly toward him, his eyes fixed on Daryl. "You shouldn't have come here. You should have listened," he said, his voice unnervingly calm. "Now you'll never leave." As Reggie reached out to grab him, Daryl felt a chill run down his spine. He turned and bolted for the elevator, smashing the button repeatedly until the doors finally closed. His heart pounded as he rode down to the lobby, praying that he would make it out of the hospital alive. When the doors opened, Daryl sprinted across the lobby and out into the night, not stopping until he was blocks away from the hospital. He gasped for breath, his mind reeling from the terror he had just experienced. Daryl knew he could never go back to that hospital, but he also knew that he would never be able to forget what he had seen on the 13th floor. My mom is superstitious. She has always adhered to silly, nonsensical rules like not stepping on cracks or tossing salt over her shoulder if you spill it, rules that may or may not have any true origin or reason. These are things people follow blindly, even though we all know there are no consequences for breaking them. One of my earliest memories involves my mom nervously demanding I hold my breath until she says otherwise. I don't remember where we were coming home from late at night, but Mom and Dad were in the front seat, and I was in a car seat, half asleep. Suddenly she said urgently, "Jason, hold your breath." She'd smacked Dad on the arm. "You too, please. Just do it." Then she'd gulped in a big breath and held it as we traveled down the foggy night road. Once she released her breath and said, Okay, my dad laughed. He was used to her superstitions and normally just went along to make her happy. Why'd I have to hold my breath, Mommy? I'd asked. Mom swiveled in her seat to look at me. Because we were getting ready to pass a graveyard. Didn't you see it? I hadn't seen it, which I was glad about. It probably would have spooked me out. I shook my head. Well, anytime you pass a graveyard at night, you must hold your breath until you make it safely past. I frowned and wrinkled my nose. You do? Why? I asked. She gave me a serious look. Son, you just do, that's why. To be safe. That's why it's so important to always pay attention to your surroundings. Sometimes I think back to that and laugh a little. To think it's important to pay attention to your surroundings for the sole purpose of knowing when you're passing a graveyard. It's sort of funny. Do you know what it takes to get hired at a graveyard? Like as a job? Well, actually, in my case, it took exactly no effort. It took my dad drinking coffee with the city workers at the local diner on Sunday mornings and volunteering me when they said they needed a part-time groundskeeper. I didn't particularly care for the idea, but I did like money. And spring had come, so the weather was getting pretty nice. So I guess I didn't mind too much when I started working Mondays, Wednesdays, Fridays after school, and Saturday mornings at our town's small cemetery. I'd go and prune bushes, pick up fallen tree limbs, cut the grass, and weed-eat carefully around tombstones. I was a teenager, but I was a pretty nice kid. I felt respectful of the place's residents, and I treated the grounds with proper reverence. I even came to enjoy the job. Sometimes when I came, there would have been a funeral earlier in the day. The casket would be lowered into the ground, and the mourners would be gone by the time I arrived. But the grave would be uncovered, with a pile of dirt still next to the chasm in the earth, waiting to be filled in. Or I would arrive on a Saturday to find a grave or two dug, a deep, perfect rectangle, awaiting a funeral later in the day, yet to have a casket lowered in. I hated to admit it, but I always liked the smell of the freshly dug graves. It generated a natural, earthy scent. Sometimes I felt the graveyard smelled old and stale, and also a little like an old lady due to the mixture of flower arrangements both growing and wilting away. It was probably all in my head. I supposed it was normal to just think that a graveyard smelled odd because a graveyard was an odd place. Nonetheless, I liked the ageless smell of the freshly turned earth. I never saw anybody digging the graves. Month after month passed, and I never caught a glimpse of anyone doing it. I also wondered why the graves were left open after a funeral. Why didn't the gravedigger come and fill it in right away? It seemed sort of eerie and maybe a safety hazard. Normally I was alone in the graveyard during my short shifts, but once in a while I would cross paths with another city worker who'd come in on some errand or task. The guy who sort of ran the graveyard, if that's a thing, was a grumpy old guy who never had much to say. One Saturday morning I asked him about the gravedigger. "Hey George," I asked, "how come you never see the person who digs the graves around here?" We were in a small office next to the main mausoleum, and George's eyes shot up from the stack of papers he was shuffling through. "Kind of question is that?" he grunted. I shrugged. "I dunno. Just curious." I guess George gave me a sharp look, staring at me for a second. "He works at night," he finally barked. "Oh, always. Like he never needs a night off to work in the day instead." He was glowering at me then. Boy, it's a job for the nighttime. "Now, if you ain't got nothing to do, I reckon you can just skedaddle." From then on, I got sort of obsessed with the gravedigger. Thinking of it as a job that had to be done strictly at night made it all the more strange and alluring to me. Who was this person? What had drawn him to this sort of work? What was he like if he'd been spending a lot of time at night, all alone, digging graves? What did he look like? Why? Why on earth did he do this? I talked to my friend Jacob about it. I told him one day about all the open graves that popped up in the morning, what grouchy old George had told me about the night gravedigger, and my general fascination with this person. Jacob stared at me blankly. "Dude, you're nuts," I laughed. "Seriously, I think working in the graveyard has gotten to you. I need to tell your parents to make you quit that job," I chuckled again. "Nah, it's a surprisingly okay job. Nothing creepy or like crazy making has ever happened." I bugged out my eyes and lurched at him playfully. He ducked out of my way. Seriously, though, I continued. "Don't you ever think about what certain jobs are like? Like being a garbage collector or an NFL football player?" Those are two really random selections, but yeah, I guess I kind of think a lot about law enforcement. I might like to go that route when I'm older. See, that's exactly what I mean. You think about jobs and wonder about what the job is like, and maybe about what sorts of people do certain jobs, right? Jacob shrugged. "Yeah, I guess. Seems legit." "So yeah, then you get what I'm saying. You're already thinking about a law enforcement career. What I want to know is, who wakes up one day and goes, 'Boy, I really feel passionate about pursuing a career in the field of digging graves.'" Jacob cracked up laughing. "Okay, yeah, I guess I see your point. So the guy never comes around except late at night? There's literally no way you could get to meet him, I don't think so. So I guess you have to go there at night then." I frowned. There is no way I could get out late at night unnoticed. And anyway, it's illegal to go into a cemetery past dark if you don't work there, dude. "You do work there," Jacob informed, rolling his eyes. "Well, I mean, it wouldn't be my time to work, so it wouldn't be okay for me to be there. And anyway, don't you think it might kind of freak him out if someone just showed up late at night?" Jacob thought about it for a minute. "Well then, I guess your only option if you really wanted to get a look at this guy would be to install a camera," what I cried. "Sure. Like a little motion-activated camera. Like a Ring doorbell or something. Just put it somewhere that it most likely won't be noticed, and then it'll just kick on when someone moves near it." "That sounds sort of stalkery," Jacob shrugged. "You sound sort of stalkery, dude. Wouldn't that be pretty sketch?" "Like, don't you think we could get in trouble for this?" Jacob asked with a laugh. "I mean, I suppose you could get in trouble. But the trick would be to leave it somewhere low-key and then get rid of it once you're satisfied. And if someone finds it and bothers to trace who it belongs to, which they probably wouldn't, then you could just make up something about being worried about vandals and trying to do a community service." "Wow. Great idea," I exclaimed. "You have sort of a criminal mind for someone who wants to be a cop. Hey, well, maybe that'll make me an excellent cop." Within the next week, we had gotten hold of a small motion-activated camera and set it up to notify my phone when it was triggered. I happened to know that a funeral was scheduled for that Saturday, so I planted the camera where it would be triggered near the site of the new grave. Jacob planned to spend the night at my house so we could finally see this mysterious person. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. That night, after my parents had gone to bed, we snuck to my room and stared intently at my phone, waiting for a notification. We must have fallen asleep because my phone startled us awake, buzzing violently. "It's going off," Jacob shouted. I grabbed my phone and brought up the camera feed. We could see something faintly. Something was definitely moving, and then we could see a figure emerge into view. He wasn't terribly far from the camera, but we still couldn't make out his face. "I'll try to enhance it," Jacob offered. He reached over me and tapped my phone. The screen brightened, and the camera zoomed in closer. Jacob and I sat and stared. The figure was bent over, doing something with the ground. The way he moved looked so strange. He wasn't using a shovel like I'd expected. He seemed to be clawing at the ground with his hands, digging vigorously. "What's he doing?" Jacob whispered. "I don't know," I whispered back. He's not digging with a shovel, Jacob stated the obvious. I don't know why, I said, keeping my eyes glued to the screen. Suddenly the figure stopped digging and stood up straight, and we could make out the rest of him. His hair was long and scraggly, and his clothes looked like they were torn and dusty. His eyes looked dark, even though he was standing a decent distance from the camera. He took a deep breath, stretching his mouth wide as he breathed in. Jacob and I looked at each other, freaked out but fascinated. Why is he doing that? Jacob asked. Doing what I wanted to know. Breathing in so deeply like that. Oh, maybe he's catching his breath. He's been digging for a while. We stared for a few more minutes as the figure went back to clawing at the ground. He was taking great swipes at it with his hands, and dirt was going everywhere. Suddenly, there was a dull thud and a loud screech from the phone. Ah, Jacob and I both cried. What was that? I exclaimed. I don't know, Jacob yelped. We stared back at the camera to see the figure was hunched over the grave again, and then he was reaching down to pick something up. He's holding something, I whispered. We leaned in closer to the screen. Is that? I gasped, my voice sticking in my throat. That looks like I couldn't finish the sentence. Jacob was staring open-mouthed. The figure stood up again, this time holding up what looked like a long, thin rod. It took us a moment to realize what it was, a bone. He held it up and looked at it, then slowly turned his head in our direction. He looked directly into the camera, and we could see his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Jacob and I both let out startled gasps and nearly dropped the phone. The figure started to move towards the camera, and we scrambled to turn it off. What is he doing? Jacob whispered frantically. I don't know, I whispered back. We have to go see, Jacob urged. I shook my head. No way. That's crazy, come on, we have to go, we can't just leave him there. Jacob insisted. We grabbed our flashlights and hurried downstairs, trying to keep as quiet as possible so as not to wake my parents. We crept outside and made our way to the graveyard. As we approached the area where the camera was set up, we could see the figure in the distance. He was still standing near the open grave, holding the bone. We hesitated, unsure of what to do next. Should we call the police? I asked. No, let's just see what he does, Jacob replied. We watched as the figure slowly lowered the bone back into the grave and began to cover it with dirt. He moved with a slow, deliberate grace, as if he was performing some kind of ritual. Once he was done, he stood up and looked around, seeming to take in the surroundings. Then, without warning, he turned and started walking towards us. We need to hide, Jacob whispered urgently. We ducked behind a nearby tree, trying to stay out of sight. The figure passed by, and we held our breath, hoping he wouldn't notice us. He continued walking, and we breathed a sigh of relief once he was out of sight. Let's get out of here, I whispered to Jacob. We made our way back home as quietly as possible, both of us shaken by what we had witnessed. The next day, we went back to the graveyard to retrieve the camera. As we approached the area, we noticed that the grave was completely covered up, and there was no sign of the figure. Do you think it was all just a dream? I asked Jacob. I don't know, he replied. But I think we should keep this to ourselves for now, we agreed, and went our separate ways, both of us unsure of what we had seen. From that day on, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease whenever I passed by the graveyard. I couldn't shake the feeling that the gravedigger was still out there, watching and waiting.